RT is sitting down with broadcaster and best-selling author Laura Flanders. Laura, thank you very much for joining us today.
I'm glad to be with you.
Let's get right into it. My first question to you is about it being over 2 years since Barack Obama has been elected as president. And through your eyes, which of his very ambitious promises has he kept?
Well, I think he's kept the one which was he's going to try. And I think that he has been trying, but the change that he promised, the hope that people had, I think it's living on life support at this point. He came into office with a vast majority of people behind him, and he had built such a sense of expectation that I think people's hopes, many of them, are really dashed.
Because he started on such a high pedestal, what do you think it means for him in the next presidential election?
Well, let's hope we don't focus on the next presidential election for the next 2 years, because that's what happens in American politics. We've got a lot more important things to do, and you kind of wish for a president that wasn't about getting reelected, that was really about making the change that he thinks the country needs, instead of trying to guarantee his return to the White House. But for sure, one of the challenges this administration has, and this president has, is to keep engaged its base, because it's only because of grassroots organizing that this Barack Obama presidency ever came about. So his biggest challenge, I think, these next 2 years is to try to keep them in some way engaged when he sold out most of the signature pledges that he made to them in 2008.
Why is that? Is it because there were too many challenges? Is it because the change that he promised was a change that was too big for America at the time?
Well, it's a long list, but I think you've got a very, very troubled democracy in the United States where corporate influences run amok. And he came into office on the back of a lot of campaign contributions, first and foremost from Wall Street. So in some sense, if he wants to get reelected and keep friendly with those that brought him into office on the financial side, well, then he's going to be nervous about chomping down on that hand that feeds him. He's going to be nervous about abandoning some of those folks whose contributions he took. So you've got a troubled democracy. You've got people in trouble. We've got an economy that was in crisis when he came into office. It's still in crisis. The only difference now is that we're being told that the recession is over. We're being told that a recovery is taking place. For most Americans, it's really not. So, the challenge that he faced was overwhelming, there's no question, and 8 years of Bush left this country in a disastrous state. But the nature of our democracy, I think, is what he's up against. His own hands being tied by the people that brought him this far, and, of course, the state of our congressional system, where you have this insane filibuster rule that enables the Senate, and did enable the Senate, the Republicans in the Senate, to basically shut down any initiative coming out of the Democrats. They said, we're not going to take any action on anything, and that's basically what they did, and I think that surprisingly came as a shock to Barack Obama.
Now, you mentioned the hand that feeds. How do you describe the relationship between Washington and Wall Street right now?
Well, it's very complicated. Barack Obama received more money from Wall Street firms when he was running for office than any other candidate, and yet he comes in as the progressive candidate. Makes sense of that. I don't see how we can keep having elections when anonymous sources, they don't even have to reveal who they are pouring billions of dollars, as they did into this midterm race, over $4 billion, almost as much as was spent on the presidential race in 2008, into midterm races where little Congress people who've never really had a fight for re-election suddenly found themselves up against a huge money machine that they couldn't fight back. That's not democracy. That's something else.
Now, if we talk more about the recession, we've seen corporations be saved by the government. So apparently Washington had enough money to save the corporations, and yet millions of people are essentially not being saved by any means at this point. Millions are jobless, people don't have homes. How come the government just doesn't print that money like they did essentially for corporations?
Well, it's an excellent question, because you've got now, with the latest numbers that came out as we're speaking show that the 5 biggest banks, Goldman Sachs, Morgan Stanley, Citibank, and Bank of America, have seen their biggest revenues ever. And you've got, in general, the financial sector bouncing back to conditions of profit and bonuses that haven't been seen in decades, in many cases the highest on record. Somehow this country's been persuaded that the first and foremost important thing to do is to help the super wealthy, and then somehow it will trickle down on the rest. Well, we've known that was bunk for 40 years, but there hasn't been, I don't think, a loud enough argument coming from the left to explain how that money that's pumped in at the top tends to remain unspent. You've got $1.8 trillion sitting in private bank accounts untouched. The government keeps giving money to private employers, but they keep not employing anyone, and banks are sitting on that cash. And when you, by contrast, pour the money into the lowest part of the economy, then you have a much better chance of stimulating the economy. That's the argument that hasn't been made loudly enough.
What about the money being pumped into defense? Is it essentially worth it to be spending billions and billions of dollars on warfare? And, what are these endless efforts for?
Well, it's been very interesting in the WikiLeaks documents that have been released over the last few weeks. As we've seen, the American power is evident, not just in how many weapons this country has, but in the pressure it's able to bear on just about every embassy around the world to do its bidding. The U.S. arms race to become by far the most weaponized nation on earth is an asset when it comes to the State Department bullying other countries and undermining their democracy to get what they want. You've seen tremendous power come to the United States, but you've come to see, I think, the cost as our economy crumbles.
Where does this kind of right to bully other countries stem from, and why do other countries allow that to happen?
Well, I think
the United States really that powerful? Well,
I think other countries might be about to fight back. In Europe, we're seeing a very big explosion of fury in Spain and in Germany as the cables reveal the degree to which the State Department has tried to bully those governments. In the Spanish case, to actually stop an investigation of U.S. terror tactics. In the German case, again, to not bring a lawsuit against CIA agents who lifted German civilian off the streets and sent them to a so-called black site for interrogation. I mean, this stuff is getting a response elsewhere. It's just here in the United States the public's being told, oh, there's nothing much in this, in these document releases. It's all old stuff. It's not.
Now, another thing that many common Americans might not be aware of is that the U.S. involvement in Afghanistan has actually now been longer than its involvement in the Second World War. And I'm sure many people, when they hear this, would say, wow, that means it's a really long time. Why? Who profits? And is there really a win outcome for the United States there?
Well, I think it's obvious that there's not. And again, to go back to these WikiLeaks releases, you've got the ambassador in Pakistan telling the State Department, this is not working. We're seeing an increase in Taliban strength almost all across Afghanistan. We're certainly seeing a growth in the mountainous regions between Afghanistan and Pakistan. We are spending millions of dollars in pouring in aid into Afghanistan. And then we're seeing, again, according to these cables, the vice president of Afghanistan showing up in Abu Dhabi with $52 million in suitcases. A huge asset flight from an already devastatedly poor country of Afghanistan. I don't think the American population is going to stand for that. The question is whether they get to hear about it. They know they're not winning. Nobody is winning in Afghanistan. The Russians knew that. The British knew that. It's not an easy thing to win. And when we pull out as pull out we will, they'll be in sadder shape.
If we talk more about that money being pumped into Afghanistan, does it mean that this money, these billions of dollars, will essentially end up being washed down the drain when the U.S. pulls out?
I think we're going to see them at the gambling tables of Abu Dhabi by the sound of it. I mean, this is not a situation where the money is going to be traceable. And the irony of these cables is that you're seeing the State Department saying, we know we are giving money to allies who are corrupt. The trick we have now as a society, and I think it's happening in Europe and as well as in the United States, and has happened in the past in Latin America, and it's happening now, is that the populace is realizing the government isn't really working in their interests, is really not listening to them. And not only is there information being withheld by the government, but the government is lying to the people flat out to their face. We're getting a sense of that now, I think, on both the economic front and the foreign policy front. And the question is, when will there be a coherent response?
If more and more information keeps being revealed about where this money is going, corrupt forces, machinery that doesn't work, different operations being built in Afghanistan that are just not sustainable, and the money is basically disappearing, how come it's still going on? How come it's that much money, and how come it's still going on?
The United States had $9 billion, and then a little bit later another $9 billion that simply went missing in Iraq. So, this is old stuff that money disappears, and it's old stuff that money that's put into the Pentagon in this country can become part of a so-called black budget that we never really get to see much about. I mean, one of the reasons I work in independent media is, we can't be reliant on military contractors GE to bring us our news about the war any more than we can be reliant upon television networks that are run by Disney to bring us the truth about what's happening in our economy.
There was a poll out recently which said that 57% of Americans, Gallup poll, don't trust the media anymore. I mean, what does that say to us? Isn't it time for some sort of change?
Well, I mean, the media get to line up behind the president and the Congress and the local politicians. American people, I think, are very unclear about who they can trust. We've got a state of distrust, and you've put your finger on a very important element of American society right now, a level of distrust that I think is very dangerous. And we need some new relationships between people and their politicians, and between people and their press.
Talking about your latest book, At the Tea Party, what stage is America at right now with this huge level of distrust towards the media, with a certain level of distrust towards politicians in Washington, D.C., and now this huge movement appearing that some people take as a joke, others take very seriously. But what does it essentially mean? Where will this end up taking America?
Well, it goes back to that troubled democracy and those people in trouble. You know, we have a democracy that is being undermined by corporate influence and the ability of one large megaphone to get behind the loudest voice and shut all the others out. These are the same folks we've seen around for decades, the Christian right, the militia movements, the gun rightsers, the anti-tax people, the anti-immigrant people, the libertarians, but they have a new face of the Tea Party, reframed as an economic movement, and frankly they're taking advantage of media power that they never had and a kind of limpness on the liberal side that used to be more fight.
Laura Flanders, thank you very much for your time with us.
You're welcome.